Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we're continuing with our shirim on the Mittler Rebbe Shaar HaYichud. We've taken a few weeks off from it, but we're picking up where we left off in Parak Tes Zayin. And what the Mittler Rebbe has been doing for us throughout the Sefer is giving us a derech harucha shehi ketzera. The derech harucha is the seder hashtalshlus from the highest points of conscious awareness, from Or Ein Sof, Kodem HaTzimtzum, as the Mittler Rebbe describes, and then slowly but surely going through each and every stage, giving us over a quintessential depiction of what Kabbalah Arizal and the Talmidim of the Arizal are being masbir to us, and he's bringing us slowly but surely each shar into the gates of understanding, so that we can understand how that which is all the way above can begin to express itself down below. The ultimate question of the interface, or the paradoxical dance that continues to subsist itself and reveal more between that which is infinite and that which is emergent as finite from within the infinite. And what the Mittler Rebbe has been giving us in very specific detail, but also in terse form, is the stages, one stage after the other. And after describing all of the stages within the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu prior to the Tzimtzum, which is the emergence of the Yecholes, the possibility of possibility, prior to any possibility of distinction, but rather pure possibility, and then the slow and steady Seder HaShtalshalos within the Olamus of Or Ein Sof Kavyachol, which is going down to Ziv Ha'atzmi and Shmo Ha'atzmi and Or Ha'atzmi v'chule, all of the differentiated levels that we've spoken about already, until we come to the place of the Or Ein Sof Kodem HaTzimtzum, and then there's the Tzimtzum, and then as a result of the Tzimtzum, there's the Chalal HaPanui, but that Chalal HaPanui contains within itself an irreducible remainder of the infinite light, which is even more potent because now it has the ability to begin to congeal itself in the secret of the Koyach HaGvul, Bebilti Gvul, the potential of limitation that emerges from within the infinite and the unlimited itself, which existed by way of mere possibility prior to the Tzimtzum. But what the Tzimtzum does is it reveals the capacity of the infinite light to manifest itself and express itself by way of limitation, without that limitation serving as a contradiction to the infinite nature, but rather a paradox that is perpetually revealing more and more. And after describing the Rishimu, we discussed the entrance of the Kav, into the Chalal HaPanui. And so what we're going to be learning now, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. We're not in Parak Tes Zayin, we're in Parak Tes Vav. So what we're going to be learning about now is Parak Tes Vav. And the entry point, no, I'm wrong. Sorry, we're in Tes Zayin. We're talking about the entry point of the Kav and the Chut into the Chalal HaPanui. This is something we've been discussing in the Shirim under Ramchal and Adir Bamarom as well. And what the Mittler Rebbe is going to be giving to us right now is that what happens in the Chalal? What happens after this Chalal has formed? And yes, the Chalal is ultimately reflective of the Koyach of the Rishimu and the irreducible trace and the Shoresh HaKelim and the emergence of the Tzimtzum from within its potential into actualization. But we're still talking about the most primary form and blank page, so to say, upon which existence is going to be written. All of the stages that the Mittler Rebbe has been walking us through are all still prior to the beginning of the actualization of the worlds of limitation, which are going to represent the world of Adam Kadmon, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, which is what the bedrock of the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital is about. We're operating within the Chalal HaPanui prior to the emergence of the worlds. Yes, it seems like we've gone down 1,000 levels, but there's infinite levels between Atzmusa Yisbarach Kavyachol and the emergence of the possibility of a Chalal HaPanui, of Ein Aruch L'cha. There's no Erech in the end of the day. There's no possible point of reference in which created existence can climb its way back up to the absolute Atzmus Kavyachol of whatever that might mean, because that's always in the secret of Kedushasi L'mala Mikdush. On the level of Ein Doma, we can begin to see how these gradational levels of descent can be traced back upwards to the Yecholes or to the Ziv Ha'atzmi or to Shmo Ha'atzmi. But ultimately, there will always be a level of Ein Aruch, which reveals the fundamental gap that operates between the creator and creation on a graspable or revealed way. And so we're getting to this place where the Chalal HaPanui is beginning to emerge. And in this Chalal HaPanui, there's the Rishimu. And what we spoke about already from the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, because in Chabad and Chasidus, as well as in the Gra, as well as in all of the Tzadikim Kemat, and even though it's Tzadikim where they were vocally not focused on this element of the Kabbalah of the Arizal. It wasn't that they were in disagreement with it, it just was that they were following the interdiction against speaking about it. But prior to the worlds that Rav Chaim Vital describes, and it could be that we'll have a whole shir on this, but prior to the worlds that Rav Chaim Vital describes are the worlds of Mahari Sarug. Mahari Sarug, Rav Yisrael Sarug was a Talmud of the Arizal who drew the Kabbalah of the Arizal towards Italy, towards the Ramami Panau, towards the development of those Svarim like the Emek HaMelech. And in those Svarim, even though there are hints in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital, those Svarim speak about worlds of Olam Malbush. They speak about the worlds of the primordial Torah, the garment of God, so to say, which is very different than the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital. The worlds of Rav Chaim Vital are ultimately a process of hishtalshelus, of one thing leading to another, of a chain-like unfolding where the previous level gives birth to the next intermediary level, and that intermediary level begins to be the link in the chain that draws the level higher to it to the level below it in the beginning, middle, and end of a process. But every descent from a level is ultimately a transition away from the previous level and a descent away from the value of that previous level and an entrance into the lower level. So there is higher and lower. It's far more hierarchical. Even though it's fundamentally unified, it still speaks in a language of hierarchy, of an oirech, of above and below. But the worlds of Mahari Sarug, the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, which is the Kabbalah of the Arizal, speak of the primordial worlds of the Olam HaMalbush, and it speaks of the primordial worlds of the Tihiru Ilah, the purified openness, the purified columns of air, the Avir Kadmon. It speaks about the Tihiru Tata, the lower element of this purified supernal space, which begins to be the very tip and the top point of the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital. And so by linking the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital, which is after the Tzimtzum, with the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, which describes the processes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes through, so to speak, to emerge out of himself, which is very different than the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital. It's very different than the top leading to the bottom and the bottom leading to another level, etc., like a chain of being. Over here, in the worlds of Mahari Sarug, the Tzimtzum is far less of a contraction or a constriction or a concealment and far more of a revelation. It's the expression of that which is latent and potential within the infinite, so to say, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to be Megala himself, and that's the Sheer B'Koach, that he estimated the space, so to say, that would be necessary for the unfolding process of existence. In the worlds of Mahari Sarug, in the Kabbalah of the Olam HaMalbush, and the Tihiru Ilah, so we speak of the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu by way of externalization, Kahadin Kamsa de Levushim in like the locust whose exoskeleton is an emergent thing from within the very inner of it that it's coming to protect. The same halacha that a person cannot be mechitza for themselves. I can't cover my own head and make a bracha because I can't cover myself with myself, because the self is always itself, even if it's expressing itself in a differential way. So too, so to say, with regards to the Gilui of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinite light, that if the tzimtzum is simply just an externalization of that which is interior, then ultimately, even though it looks like a nice trick, we can see through the trick and realize that the tzimtzum itself is revelatory of the very thing that it's coming to conceal, which is the secret of Kahadin Kamsa de Levushim in where the concealment is emergent from within the inner recesses of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light, so that even the concealment, Kam Choshech Lo Yashkech Mimcha, over here it's far more about an emergent process and a fluid process rather than a process of one chain leading to another to another. And the fundamental importance of all of the tzaddikim who linked the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, these primordial worlds of Olam HaMalbush, with the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital, which is the Kabbalah of the worlds of Adam Kadmon and Atzilus Bri Yitzir and Asiya, it allows us to understand that the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital and what we're talking about after the Tzimtzum is ultimately and can be abstracted back up to the point prior to the Tzimtzum into those inner interiority spaces, which are all separate from the essential and absolute light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Atzmos Kaviyachol, but nevertheless they're fundamentally contained as the original Giloi, and they're a direct expression of the essence and the essential nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And within that paradox of something not being able to be touching the Atzmos, but nevertheless not separate and apart from the Atzmos, but rather a reflection of a secondary form of the Atzmos that has a fundamental bond and a primary connection that can never be broken with the original form of Atzmos that doesn't come into conversation. In all of those mysteries of the Tzimtzum HaMavhil and that bewildering Tzimtzum wherein the mind's capacity to grasp is undone, the connection to the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug allows us to link the limited system, so to say, of Rav Chaim Vital back up to the unlimited system of Mahari Sarug. And this is expressed in the Talmidim of the Rashash as well, that really, in truth, just as every time we look at a partsuf, it has a nefesh and a ruach, it has the Zayin Tachtonos, it has Chesed, Gur, Tferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, and our job is to draw down the Moichin into it, the Moichin of Bina, the Moichin of Chachma, and ultimately the Moichin of Keser. So too, writ large, on a relative perspectival level, the entirety of the worlds of Adam Kadmo and Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, which are described in the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital, which are ultimately the sum total of the system, with Adam Kadmon being the highest thing imaginable, in relationship to the worlds of Mahari Sarug and the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug that came before the unfolding worlds of Rav Chaim Vital, prior to the Tzimtzum, but the process of the emergence of constriction and limitation from within the unlimited. In relationship to the worlds of the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital is considered as limited. It's considered as a vak. It's considered as a Zayin Tachtonos that needs to be mamshech, something moichin above. And what are those moichin? Those moichin are those three worlds described in the worlds of Mahari Sarug. And again, that's a very fast introduction to a fundamentally significant topic that we'll continue to speak about. Suffice it to say that the Chalal HaPanui and the transition between those infinite processes of unfolding from within the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and coming to that point of the Tzimtzum and the emergence of the Halal and the appearance of the Rishimu and the re-entrance of the Kav. So now when the Kav re-enters into the Halal and it attaches itself to that residual light that has always already been there, which is the Rishimu of the Or Ein Sof, which is exactly like the Or Ein Sof, in spite of the fact that it has the capacity to express itself in ways other than the Or Ein Sof. It's the Shorish of Gvul. So at this point of the interconnection between the Kav coming down into the Halal, it becomes fundamentally important for us to discuss what is the bridge, what is the linkage between those infinite worlds that preceded the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital, and those finite manifestations of the worlds that follow the Tzimtzum of Rav Chaim Vital. And what the Mittler Rebbe is going to be doing for us, and this is not to be taken for granted, Bichlal, is that in the process of describing what the Kav is doing, so what the Kav does is the Kav is the infinite light from before the Tzimtzum that descends down into the Tzimtzum itself. And once that Kav enters into the Tzimtzum, into the Chalala Tzimtzum, the Kav begins to take a shape, because just like we said in the Shirim on the Ramchal, the glyph, the engravings, that original engraving within the Rishimu, the Galuf Gilufe B'Tehiru Ilah, is ultimately the first instantiation of the pipelines through which the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to re-enter into existence by way of the Kav. The radical secret of the Kav is that now the infinite light can express itself by way of limitation without losing its infinite capacity, nor undoing its finite boundary. That's the secret of the Kav and the Chut, the miraculous paradox and the sustained paradox of the infinite light expressing itself by way of finitude, with both of those polarities maintaining their own fundamental expression, because they reveal something greater than what either of them can reveal on their own. They reveal the full totality of the relative perspective of how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu's infinitude is beyond our grasp, because he could reveal himself in infinite and as finite as well. So this entry point of the Kav into the Halal, the Kav begins to take the shape of igulim, circles. And then after the circles and the circle within the circle within the circle, which represent the 10 spheres of igulim, with the most external one being the highest level, the Keser of Igulim, and the most internal one being the Malchus of Igulim. And then inside of that is going to be the unfolding from within the Igulim of the worlds of Yoshar. And Yoshar, the direct lines, the lines of hierarchical order of left, right, and center, are eventually going to be the shape in which the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital takes. That secret of Adam Kadmon, with left, right, and center, and the Avoida of Tikkun and Oros and Kalim, v'chule, v'chule. But nevertheless, there's a certain affinity, there's a certain connection between the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, which is the preceding stage of a tzimtzum that is revelatory, prior to the tzimtzum that is concealing of Rav Chaim Vital, is the tzimtzum of Mahari Sarug, and that's going to be more akin to the ilamos of the Igulim. The Igulim are a more primordial, less developed, and less distinct system of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's expression. It contains all of the principles that are going to be found within the worlds of Adam Kanmon and downwards. It contains all of the potentia of the Seder Shtalshalis, but it's in a way in such refinement that it can't even be described as representing anything other than just the glyph, an engraving, the original engraving, which is the Shaar b'koichoi. It's the potentiation and the development of the space in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to want to unfold the Seder of Shtalshalis. And the way that these olamos of Mahari Sarug work is that there's the Olam HaMalbush, and in this Olam HaMalbush, there's a Tehiru Ilah. There's a supernal purity. This supernal purity becomes the garment, the shape upon the pure canvas, so to say, upon which existence is going to be written. It's the engraving of the engraving. Imagine a purified tablet, so to say, b'derech mashal, which begins to have sirtut being placed upon it. Now that sirtut, that engraving of lines that are going to ultimately be the place in which the ultimate writing of the incoming worlds is going to be written so that they can be readable and graspable, prior to anything being written upon it, there is the development of that pure space. Now, it's a non-spatial space. It's a potential space. It's the halal panui. It's the womb of being. It's the bina ilah, so to say. It's that place of mi madad b'sha'alomayim. It's the emergence of an empty space, but the empty space is no longer a vacancy, but it's an empty space because it is ready and primed to be written upon. It is the roshim of the infinite light, which becomes the expression of the Torah, which is going to be what the world is emergent from. And there's an upper tihiru and there's a lower tihiru. There's a tihiru ilah and there's a tihiru tata, because as long as we're talking about something that's graspable, it's always already going to be split into two levels of perspective. HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke once and reveals himself as one in an absolute singularity, but the human being, as being a byproduct of creation, is ultimately incapable of returning back to anything other than the split way in which that oneness is going to be revealed. Now that's the Yerida L'Tzarech Aliyah. The splitness of consciousness is ultimately there to unify the apparent splitness of it, of Chachma and Bina, back into the light of Keser, to reveal how even within the splitness of consciousness and the dir b'tachtonim mamish and the machshava of an individual and the chachma bina and das of an individual, where we feel most separate, where we feel most yesh, that even that we can return back to you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and say the secret of echad shu shtayim, that ultimately this splitness is reflective of a singular unity. But anytime we speak about the revelation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu beyond the absolute space of whatever atzmus Baruch might mean, which is prior to any language or contemplation, so what we have to tap into is that there's going to be two sides of it. There's a Tihiru Ilah and there's a Tihiru Tata. The Tihiru Ilah represents the lowest part of those transcendent worlds of Mahari Sarug, and the Tihiru Tata represents the emergence of those worlds of Mahari Sarug into the potential space of the worlds of Rav Chaim Vital, which is going to be the highest part of the lowest part of the lower world. So the Tihiru Tata is the lowest part of the higher world, and the Tihiru Ilah, rather, the ascendant purity, is going to be the lowest part of the higher revelations, and the Tihiru Tata is going to be the highest part of the lower revelations, which is the beginningness of space. And that's what the Mittler Rebbe is going to be talking to us about right now. He's going to be talking about what happens once the Kav enters into the Halal. What are the first things that become illuminated? What are the first processes that become illuminated? And another klal that the Mittler Rebbe is going to bring us face to face with is that just as anytime we split a system, there's an above and below, there's a higher part and a lower part. The higher part cannot be revealed, but it gives shape to the lower part being revealed. That second edge of the Malbush, which is the lower half, the Tihiru Tata, which is a fundamental revelation of the Tihiru Ilah, except that the Tihiru Ilah, due to its supernal purity, cannot emerge into the territory of spatiality or the potential space, and therefore that takes shape by way of the Tihiru Tata. The Tihiru Tata is fundamentally and inherently connected with the Tihiru Ilah, just as the Kav that is coming back down into the Halal is fundamentally bound with the infinite light that preceded the Tzimtzum. It always becomes that pipeline, that point of connection in which the infinite light of all things is descending down, the infinite light behind all things that unifies all things, that gives shape to all things, that all things emerge out of, all concealment emerges out of from, that Achdus HaPashat, that light of Ani Hashem Lo Shinisi, is prior to, yet still continues to be expressed within the system at every moment. But one of the perspectival shifts that take place when we're dealing with the splitness of consciousness is that there's a makif and there's a panimi. There's a surrounding light and there's an inner light. Just as the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama is able to express itself downwards within the individual's limited space, which is going to be an or panimi, something that's graspable, there's also going to be makifim, lights that surround consciousness, the chaya and the yechida, which don't enter into consciousness. But in spite of the fact that they don't enter into consciousness, nevertheless, they bear a profound import on the mechanics of consciousness. The Chaya is the Makif Karov, which enters in and that departs out. So we know that we knew something that we now don't know. And then the Makif of the Yechida is what we don't even know that we don't know, or what we know that we don't even know, v'chule v'chule. And ultimately, any entry point of a system, we're going to have to see this Makif and this Panimi, these two stages of that which surrounds and hovers by way of transcendental non-locality, yet nevertheless has an impact and an influence, and the pnimi, which is the localized space where the light is expressed within a vessel and it has a real import and it can be traced. Again, these two levels of makif and pnimi, igulim and yoshar, could also be compared to Mahari Sarug and Rav Chaim Vital. And so what the Mittler Rebbe is answering up here is ultimately when the Kav comes back down into the Halal, and it's the first instantiation of this splitness, of the emergence of order, and we're already split with the Tihiru Ilah and the Tihiru Tata, the Tihiru Ilah, which is that which precedes and exists outside of the entrance of the Kav into the Halal, and the Tihiru Tata, which is the beginning of the Kav expressing itself within the Halal, that we're seeing the emergence of a makif and a pnimi. So what the Mittler Rebbe is saying is that as the kav enters in and it hits that first engraving of the first igul hagadol, the most encompassing light, the first engraving, the first centering of that infinite light through the kav that is going to begin to engrave the shape of existence. So what is that? What is that? And what the Mittler Rebbe is going to basically say is that this is going to be the first makif that is going to be expressed ultimately as the ground upon which all of existence continues to maintain its bond with that which is beyond its comprehension, is going to be this thing called the Tihiru Tata, the lower purity, the lower supernal purity, which is the pureness of non-being, but has already primed itself to receive the imprint of being, as opposed to the Tihiru Ilah, which is not even at the point where it is ready to receive the imprint of being. It's prior to that, in spite of the fact that there's the potentiation of that in the secret of Shir Ba'atzmo v'chule. And ultimately, we're not even going to go into the parak right now. I want to end with this introduction because I want to give due respect to each and every word. But the reason this becomes fundamentally important, and the Mittler Rebbe is revealing any derech of hisbonenus of the Seder Ishtalshelus has to be al pi ha'avoda, which means that we have to find a place within ourselves that we're able to access this. So what value might there be in talking about the Tihiru Ilah and the Tihiru Tata, these transcendental supernal realms of engraving prior to engraving that can become the prime place of the eventual emergence of existence, these worlds of the infinite, this Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug, these transcendent realms that transcend transcendence, what value is there? And ultimately, what the Tzemach Tzedek says in numerous places, that neshama shenasat to be tahirahi, that when we talk about the neshama that HaKadosh Baruch Hu places within us, is that it's purified, it's tahor. What that means is that we're saying that my neshama is rooted in the Tihiru Ilah, that ultimately our neshama is a chelek Elokai mimal ma'amish, which is that hidden, mysterious, impossible, paradoxical way in which the core of Nishmas Yisrael is reflective of the atzmus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kaviyachol by way of the infinite simsumim, to the point that the yesh hatachton is reflective of the yesh ha'amite v'chule v'chule. But everything we're talking about now has a place within the soul, that when we can understand these lofty, lofty places of the engravings prior to the engravings and the emergence of the prior engraving within the place of the eventual writing, etc., so then we'll be able to understand the true potency of our soul. As Rabbi Nachman says, that the biggest nebuch in the world, the biggest rachmanis in the world, is when a yid doesn't know how high their soul is or how lofty their soul is, or me'ayin hein lekuchim, of the supernal nothingness from which we're drawn. So the more we can understand these worlds, the more we can understand the value of ourselves, and the more we can enter into the Shaar HaYichud and implement and think about these things and draw them down into our consciousness, both cognitively, by way of our speech, by way of our action, Be'ezras Hashem.